Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Crystal Morey and I'm the Senior Curator here at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. Tonight we're thrilled to have curators Candice Hopkins and Dylan Robinson with us to discuss Soundings, KWAG's summer exhibition and our first major project since the closure of most of our spaces across the country a few months earlier. This exhibition asks us how a score can become a call and a tool for decolonization. Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts, features newly commissioned scores, performances, videos, sculptures, and sound by Indigenous and other artists who respond to this question. Unfolding in a sequence of 5 parts, the scores take the form of beadwork, videos, objects, graphic notation, historical belongings, and written instructions. During the exhibition, these scores are activated at specific moments by musicians, performers, and members of the public, gradually filling the gallery and surrounding public spaces with sound and action. In the moment that we're in right now, filling the gallery looks quite different than what it would have looked like a few months ago, but any presence feels right to us right now. As is the case with live stream presentations, we are gathering around our respective screens and from various corners. And while we would much rather be sharing this conversation in physical space with you, our hope is that you will imagine yourself at KWAG. With that in mind, Candice and Dylan and I will start by respectfully acknowledging the land on which each of us is situated. Candice, would you like to start?
Thank you, Crystal, and hi everyone out there in virtual space. I'm speaking to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache land since time immemorial. Because it's close to the river, it's always been a meeting place for people, continues to be. The city itself, in fact, is surrounded by Sandia Pueblo, Isleta Pueblo, as well in Laguna. And I must say that for me, as a Canadian originally from the Yukon, felt very welcomed here in this place. So I'm greeting you from here.
Thank you. And Dylan?
Israel, Chitzalatzel, Humach Homesh, Sta Slewatith Holmach Equala. I am thrilled to be greeting you here today from Vancouver, which is the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and feel this is my home as well. As a Stalo person, we have always had intergenerational, relationships to our family here, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh family, and it's been wonderful to be back home on these lands and sort of reconnecting with family during this time. So I'm really happy to be joining everyone.
Thank you. As I mentioned, I am in Kitchener. I am at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. The space that you see behind me is not actually the gallery, but is an image of one of the stops of Soundings at an earlier juncture. And it features the work of Tanya Willard behind me, which I'm kind of blocking. But I'm in Kitchener, and for generations, this land, the land on which KWAG sits, has been the traditional home to the neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. The gallery is situated on the Haldimand Tract, and for those of us who live in this community, we should know a bit about that history. It's a large swath of land that extends 6 miles deep on each side of the Grand River, from its mouth to its source. The tract is comprised of 950,000 acres, and it was promised to the Six Nations for their role in the American Revolutionary War and the loss of their traditional lands. Today, this remains home to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who continue to steward its future. All places, including this one, have a history that's thick with meaning if we're willing to look for it and do right by it. And though colonization and its consequences continue to radically change the story of this place, it doesn't absolve us from seeking responsible ways for us to do our work, nor should it absolve us from accountability for our actions. As relative newcomers, myself included, we need to understand that caring for the land and caring for people are not discrete efforts. On behalf of my colleagues, I want to express gratitude for being able to host tonight's talk here and to share the space with Candice and Dylan, two colleagues whom I admire tremendously. I have a few bits of housekeeping that I'd like to get out of the way before we start today's conversation. And the first is to acknowledge a little bit about where Soundings came from institutionally and the support that has helped make it possible.
Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts, was organized by Agnes Etherington Art Centre, Queen's University, Canada. KWAG's presentation of this exhibition features the work of Raven Chacon and Cristobal Martinez, Sebastian Deline, Maggie Grote, Kite, Cheryl Larondel, Tanya Lucan Linklater, Ogi Mamikana, Peter Morin, Heidi Sinungatuk, Olivia Waitung, and Tanya Willard, along with musicians who have been invited to perform selected scores. The exhibition's curators and our guests for this evening are Candice Hopkins and Dylan Robinson. Candice Hopkins is a curator and writer originally from Whitehorse, Yukon. She is Senior Curator of the Toronto Biennial of Art and co-curator of the Site Santa Fe Biennial, Casa Tomada. She was part of the curatorial team for Documenta 14 in Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany, and a co-curator of the major exhibitions Sakahàn, International Indigenous Art, Close Encounters, The Next 500 Years, and the 2014 SITElines Biennial, Unsettled Landscapes in Santa Fe, New Mexico. A widely published writer and frequent lecturer, Hopkins is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Hnatyshyn Foundation Award for Curatorial Excellence in Contemporary Art. She is a citizen of the Carcross Tagish First Nation. Dylan Robinson is a Hoelma artist and writer of Stalo descent and the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts at Queen's University. His current work focuses on the return of Indigenous songs to communities who were prohibited by law to sing them as part of the Indian Act from 1882 to 1951. Robinson's scholarly publications include the edited volumes Music and Modernity Among Indigenous Peoples of North America, Arts of Engagement, Taking Aesthetic Action in and Beyond the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and Opera Indigene. His most recent publication, Hungry Listening, has just been published by Minnesota University Press. It's an honor to share virtual space with you both today, and I look forward to hearing more about how Soundings has evolved over time. The Tour of Soundings is organized by Independent Curators International. The exhibition and tour are made possible with generous support from ICI's International Forum, the ICI Board of Trustees, and various councils, municipalities, and funders that are listed on this slide. The Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery gratefully acknowledges the further support of the Music Eddies Fund held at Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation and the Ontario Cultural Attractions Fund. As always, we are proud to have the continued support of Cerbera Law and Momentum Developments. We're thankful for their ongoing interest in amplifying the voices of artists and curators who contribute to our programming.
We are going to be taking questions through Q&A this evening, so please send your questions through that channel. We'll do our best to raise them during the conversation. But for the moment, I really want to prioritize the voices of Candice and Dylan and learn a little bit about the evolution of Soundings because it's such an ambitious project. And yeah, I'm eager to listen. Please join me in welcoming Candice and Dylan.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thanks so much, Crystal.
So I know, Crystal, you had asked us about the origins of the exhibition, and I would say it has a few origins. One is the work that Dylan and I started doing together, and wanted to give you a background from my perspective. I know Dylan will have a different one, but I first learned of Dylan's work through the new music community in Vancouver, where he was living and working, and I thought it was pretty extraordinary to learn of someone who was not only researching new music through Indigenous perspectives, but was also looking at historical records and the way that songs had been recorded. And one of the first things that I learned about Dylan's research was looking into ceremonial songs that were recorded during what's known as the potlatch bands, and thinking about the question of how those were able to be recorded at a time when we weren't able to practice ceremonies openly. A lot of things had to go underground, but it was completely okay for an ethnomusicologist or an anthropologist to record these songs. But in many cases, what was left out, I think, were the protocols around them. And so I've been learning a lot from Dylan. Another thing that we've talked a lot about is not only what it might mean to have a practice of decolonial listening, which I think really framed this project of soundings, but what that might look like through different, very specific perspectives. And I'm also very grateful for my time at the Western Front, because that's how I had also been introduced to Dylan, and through DB Boyko, who was a longtime curator there. So I'm really grateful for that initial introduction to learn about your research, Dylan.
Thanks, Candice. I mean, we've been working together now for quite a long time. It's lovely to be able to think about the thinking, the space of thinking and sharing ideas that we've had. I don't even know for how many years. It's probably not as long as I'm thinking, but it feels so generous and wonderful. It feels much longer, I think, probably than it actually is. If I'm remembering back, I think I've known about your work in curatorial practice for much longer than I've known you. But as a person, I think I remember the first connection being through Raven. And Raven and I, Raven Chacon, have had long correspondence. Raven, of course, is a composer and sound artist, and I've been thinking about Raven's work for a while. And so thinking, I was doing this work on music and compositional practice and thinking about decolonization and settler colonialism from within those two areas, and then started to shift a little bit to thinking more about public space and how we occupy our lands and public space, how they are occupied, and particularly how artwork occupies public space. And so I was starting to move into this new area of arts in public space, public art, and Indigenous public art specifically. And I remember having a conversation with, it was either Raven or maybe it was David Garneau, and they said, oh, you should really talk to Candice Hopkins about this. She's working on a number of different projects. And so I reached out briefly to Candice, and then I think, I'm not even, yeah, anyways, started this whole conversation on public art that then eventually shifted to include sound-based work. And of course, we're still engaged in a number of different smaller projects on public art, and soundings also includes some public works. So I have been just thrilled to work alongside you and think about the work that we do in public spaces as Indigenous people, the work that still remains to be done, and how we go about doing that, particularly as Indigenous people creating work on the lands of other Indigenous people, raising those questions of what protocol guides that work. How do we understand the way we do that work, in relationship rather than against possibly work that people whose lands those are doing already or just doing in different ways. So I think those are some really fruitful conversations that we've been having that also tie into this part of Soundings now, as it is touring across many different lands of Indigenous peoples. How does this work need to shift and change as it moves from place to place, so that we don't reinscribe a kind of colonial model of the touring exhibition where you go in and presume that something will have relevance or just sort of overstep without having conversations with the people whose lands the work is being situated on. So yeah, it's been great to allow this work to grow, and I know we'll discuss the ways in which the work has really shifted already, quite substantially, even though it hasn't been that long since the original Agnes Etherington exhibition took place.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Dylan, you know, one of the origins that was already alluded to by Crystal of this exhibition was the question of how we could organize an exhibition as a score. So thinking of the exhibition as something that is iterative, so it can take place over time, can shift over time, can start to include new iterations of an existing work, or even new players, new performers. And that's something that, Crystal, you've really been the custodian of at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. And it's an unconventional framework. We even wrote a curatorial score that helps, I think, frame the viewer's experience with works. And I know one of the things that we'll talk about later is how you do that, especially in a time of the pandemic. But that was one of our questions. And I think also coming from a shared interest in not only scores, text-based scores, instructions, things that can unfold in a series of actions. So even the exhibition itself is installed in stages, which is kind of can be a challenge. But our idea is that any time that someone witnesses a version of Soundings, it'll be different. And it will gather information and performances as it goes on, which become part of, you know, edited videos as well. And in a way, it was a very ambitious way of putting together an exhibition. But our question was too, is how responsive can we make galleries which have over time become quite fixed kind of spaces, like literally white cubes. So we were thinking about how to challenge that too.
I think important for me in that is also this sense of pushing the accumulation of our presence as Indigenous people, artwork, you know, changing the atmospheres of the galleries by having sort of the most accumulations in many senses, accumulations of sound and movement and action and spilling out of the gallery into public space. It is, you know, as Candice said, an ambitious exhibition, but also meant to be ambitious in the way it pushes at the I think at the foundations of the gallery, and, you know, in relationship to those structures, and it tries sometimes to make space to amplify certain things and really wrest that that white cube apart in many ways. So, you know, Crystal, our immense gratitude to you and your team there for all you have done. I hope I say this not curators who are involved in the exhibition or may want to be, but the idea of accumulation and sort of pushing at those, within those spaces is really important for me to acknowledge, and also the work that's done to enable that to happen. So thank you.
It is, if I may just interrupt you both for a second, I want to make sure I don't lose touch of, you know, the idea that there is something remarkably disruptive about a project like this, which is, I think, what we need, right? Like if as institutions, and I guess I'm speaking right now from the perspective of somebody who works in a museum, and we know what museums are like. They don't really deal with change easily or comfortably, and so having a different kind of model for a tour was such a test for us. Because admittedly, I'm also thinking, okay, well, a touring show, we kind of know how this is going to go, right? We've done these things before. And from the get-go, there was an understanding that no, we have to reimagine our definition of what it means to care for an exhibition too. So it's not a matter of just ensuring that the elements, the environmentals, are hospitable to work, but it's a matter of like staying with the work and being in the space, enabling its evolution. Like those, I think, were the real tests for us to recognize that our position within the institution had to be a much more active one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Crystal, you've said this as well. Even a work like Tanya Willard's behind you has different iterations. So when it was at the Agnes Etherington, for example, it was sparked by a procession and a performance as well by Janine Frey-Njutli, and then which included the cutting of wood with a copper gilded axe. And then the wood was carried by all of us, the audience members, us together, and we took it to the only Indigenous space really on the Queen's campus, and we had a fire and we sat around the fire and we sat in a teepee that they have there full time at Four Directions. And that felt kind of amazing because I think what we were doing in that moment was we were actually drawing a line between the gallery and this space, and we were taking people to it, which I think kind of shifted also the social sense of that work as well. And there were literal disruptions in, you know, the chopping of the axe, for example, and how that was seen and understood by others. And I know that that these kinds of things continue. We had a performance the other night by Suzanne Kite, but one of the things that I wanted to say was, I think in stretching the idea of what a gallery or museum can do, one of the important things that came out of it were, I think, the ability to follow the protocol set by an artwork. So for example, Tanya Lucan-Linklater's piece is really thinking about how a seal gut parka can be a score for a new choreography that was initially performed by dancers that she collaborates with a great deal, as well as violinist Laura Ortman. But one of the important things that she did was she wanted to use that space to set in motion a kind of different idea of repatriation, what we might consider to be repatriation otherwise. So one of the first things that she did was she flew to Manitoba, to the Manitoba Museum of Man, where the parka was held in their collection, visited with it for, I think, about 3 days, to also ask its permission and to see if it was willing to travel, because it was borrowed for the Agnes. One of the things that she didn't want to do was replicate the way that it's displayed normally. So it was made on placed on custom plinths, laid down very, very carefully. This new choreography unfolded from there. And now at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, it's shown as a video and a sound work. But one of the things that I think that deeply questioned is how even the idea of repatriation has shifted from potentially not being so necessarily so focused on an endgame of cultural belongings returning to their homelands, especially when those homelands aren't necessarily known, but finding different ways of being with them, different ways of thinking about, you know, how we can care for them, how we can provide a sense of agency. And Dylan, I know that you worked closely with Heidi Sonungatuk, and I think that that was another example of how an exhibition can be a decolonial actor within a museum.
Yeah, I think this is something that's on a lot of artists' minds, Indigenous artists' minds, and our minds as Indigenous peoples. The return of our ancestors and belongings and life into our communities, but also the reconnection of that. And that's sometimes the part that has fallen through in previous repatriation work. Of course, depending, there's so many different examples of this, but I'd say there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on how do we reconnect these ancestors with our people where there's been 100 years or more of disconnection. If you think about family and having 100 years of where we've experienced maybe, you know, with COVID now, several months of disconnection. Imagine 100 years of disconnection between a member of your family, a member of your community, and yourself. So one of the things I think that a number of the artists have really tried to do within Soundings is think about those forms of connection, but the connection we have with each other as you know, members coming to a gallery space, but also the connection that we have with those belongings or ancestors or life, right? What is that? And so, yes, Tanya Lucan-Linklater's work, Heidi Sonungatuk's work, Heidi worked with the Agnes collection of carved ivories from her territory and other territories in the north, some of which were for trade, but bringing those out into the exhibition space and creating a new situation where their life was in relationship again with words, you know. So there was this sort of medial reconnection as well in the projection that's used there. I like to think about that as the sort of a projection for the belongings, right, rather than for the audience. It's that film that's being played for them. That's lovely. But also Peter Moran's work, thinking about the work that he did for the exhibition, Indian love songs, his work really it came out of a long process of working with Royal BC Museum, and he's done a lot of work, a lot of different projects with Royal BC Museum. But what he wanted to do for Soundings was to go back to the museum and visit with working drums that have had long lives before their collection into the museum archive, and to think about what it means to be in relationship with those drums again, in a different sounding relationship, and asking musicians to perform them in a video form. So each of these drums has a video, 7 different what he calls video portraits that are always being activated visually in a movement. They're circled around. He actually holds them and moves them, so you see his face and his hands sometimes in those individual videos, which is beautiful in and of itself. But each of those video portraits then is used as a score for a musician to respond to. And what I think is beautiful about this is he asks those drums to be sounded again, albeit not through the actual sounding of the physical drums, but it's a kind of sounding back to that life that I just think is incredibly beautiful, and a form of reconnection again. The reconnection with a different kind of sound, a different kind of response to that life that we can then hear within space, that doesn't necessitate physically returning, those drums to the gallery space or to our communities. And this is not an argument as well that the physical repatriation shouldn't happen. I want to be clear about that. Absolutely, that needs to happen. But I think the work that these artists are doing is getting at a different kind of reconnection that really is meaningful. I find it incredibly meaningful to have within the space of a gallery.
Yeah, and one of the things I think about, Dylan, with regards to just the idea of sounding them or sounding back to them, is that, when many of these belongings, especially musical instruments, are put on display in museums, you actually never get the chance to hear them. So for me, I think that that's an incredibly important part of some of the interventions that artists have done, is the ability to think about what sound they emit or what sounds we can produce for them, as you said.
And in fact, in that scenario, I mean, the sort of scenario of open storage that a number of museums have now moved towards, that puts those drums or those belongings on display, which is thought of as the best thing to do, make them accessible visually at least. Your work, Candice, in particular, has really drawn out the fact that, well, if we consider these to have life, to be alive as beings, as ancestors, then what that really does is just it kind of muffles their ability to sound and have life with us, right? It makes that separation even more permanent, I feel, and really needs to be addressed. So yeah, I think Peter's response and a number of the artists' responses are really sophisticated in this way of thinking about, well, let's move beyond the containment of that vitrine, of that storage cabinet, of whatever it might be, that dampens the sound of life, and try and bring a different kind of living relationship into being, knowing maybe that we can't perform those drums because they may break, or something might happen, or it's maybe not appropriate in some cases for certain works to be used. So I really value that kind of refusal of the limitation that the museum imposes. Like, okay, well, we know the limitations are there. We know we have to work with them in one way, but let's not let that limit the way that we envision the future of Indigenous life.
Mm-hmm. Dylan, what you were speaking about earlier made me think about labor and rest. And rest, I always think of as such an important part of a musical score. And I think for many of us, the definition of a score is tethered to performance or perhaps choreography and an understanding of time and how it's organized and how it's made palpable and audible. So a performance could be ephemeral, but the score itself, the parameters could be more defined or providing a definite form of structure. I also like to think of score as it pertains to materiality. So, I think about bookmaking or printmaking. When you score a surface like paper, it creates a rupture that it disturbs its integrity and allows for it to take a sharp turn. So things fold and go in a different direction. Can you talk a little bit about how decolonization and disruption unfold in soundings, and even, if you can, a little bit about the curatorial score as well?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with the curatorial score, which is actually two scores.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's right. There's an outdoor score and the indoor score.
Yeah. So Candice and I have worked on few different iterations of these scores now, and the indoor curatorial score really tries to, from my perspective, take a moment to think through naming those relationships and those different senses of time that the works have, and literally lays them out in terms of time, in terms of the 5 parts. Not all of the works have 5 parts to them, but all of them are activated in different times and have a different kind of process that they move through. And so our curatorial score tries to mine that or sort of bring that context out in some ways. It's not a kind of show up at 2 p.m. on Friday to hear that. It's not that at all. It's a more poetic way of thinking, for me at least, about time and process and movement and relationship through language. I mean, through what we do as curators and providing context. And so that's just a bit of framing around that score. But then we also have the works outside. But I feel like our outside curatorial score, Candice, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, almost as a curatorial score to address our relationship to that place, like our relationship or the exhibition's relationship to that place, or just that place generally, working through, what's there already when you enter. What are the walls? What is the ground? These kind of questions, so that we don't feel like we're entering the gallery as terra nullius, right? That it's a space that has multiple histories. And those are histories that buildings sometimes literally cover over. And so it's a call, the outdoor curatorial score is a call to reposition ourselves, our bodies, in relationship to certain histories, but also this physical thing that you're about to enter into, the gallery. And just take a moment to think about that.
One of the things we talked about a lot with regards to the outdoor curatorial score, and it's included in the language, is the idea that, the very basis of sound are its vibrations. So even before you enter the space of the gallery, what kinds of vibrations are you feeling? What is the feel, and what is the kind of resonant frequency of brick, for example, that makes up a lot of the exterior of the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery? And also, when you're outside of the gallery, what do you hear? And what's covered over? And because we've done a lot of thought about the hierarchy of sound and listening as well, the things that you tend to tune out to, and a lot of those things are actually the sound of colonialism. In fact, it might be the hum of development. It might be the fact that you can't feel this earth under your feet because it's covered by concrete. And so that is a soundscape in and of itself. And so that was one of the things that we were thinking about. I thought it might be since, you know, we're speaking to a number of people who are outside in virtual space and can't necessarily see the exhibition right in front of us, I thought I might read just a couple of lines from the interior score so you get a sense of you know, what the prompts are, because as Dylan said, they're not, I think that we can understand them as prompts even more so than instructions. So part 1 says, listen to these rooms, hear material friction of beads upon glass, upon metal, carry a story in your hands that guides future action. Follow a map charting fictive cities of the colonial imaginary. Trace relations alongside rain-gut parka design. Watch belongings gather together, no longer nameless. So I think as curators, one of the things that we wanted to do with each of those lines was kind of call out and also honor everything that each of the artists in the exhibition have brought to this, and understanding and recognizing that it changes each time too. And one of those major changes, Crystal, is also the commissioning of a new artwork that you definitely shepherded with regards to this, and that's a very important part of it, is how it gathers voices, how it responds to every site that it goes to. Because one of the things that you've said already is that often when a gallery or museum takes a touring show, it comes as a package, and you just kind of open up that package and you put things in their place, and then you sort of let it be and see how audiences respond to that. But we weren't interested in doing that. I think that we were interested more in questions of relationality, and really embracing, I think, what is an amazing moment in music, and that is sometimes you don't know what the next sound is going to be. So you create the conditions for that. You create the conditions for improvisation, but you don't necessarily always try to control its outcome.
Mm-hmm. It's been so interesting having conversations with the performers who were scheduled to enact some of the scores. So last Saturday we had Charlena Russell here to perform Peter Moran's score, and then in July we have Alicia Brilla, who's performing Tanya Willard's score, and Long Branch performing Raven's score. And on Saturday, it was an incredible experience. Like, people have not been in this space for months. People have not been together this way for months, and people haven't heard live music for months. And so it was quite a profound experience, I think, for everybody who was present. And the musician, we had a couple of musicians there who remarked on just how much they felt the music in their bones, in their body. It was a lived and living kind of experience. And I'm so curious to know how, over the course of the exhibition, some of the artists have responded to the performances of their scores, because they're improvised in a lot of instances, right? And sometimes they might be present for the performance, but have those performances changed the work for them at all, or changed the way they think about the work?
To be honest, I haven't had a lot of conversations with the artists on about you know, this. I mean, other than really positive responses, right, to the fact that, I mean, it's a pretty unique context for your work to be. Well, it's a. I guess you should say it's more of a typical performance context, right? You have a score, and then the work does get changed in small ways, and less than, you know, in more significant ways as an orchestra performs it or a choir performs it, right? But for a visual artist, that's not often the case, right? That your work receives such significant change or interpretation, unless it's already built into the artwork. So it's a really unique experience, I think, for a lot of people to have this iterative development of a work, and I think I look forward to seeing how it becomes even more diverse. So I mean, there's a certain, I should say, there's a certain kind of musician sometimes that has more familiarity with improvisation and experimental music that typically would be fine jumping into, like, for example, you can see the score behind Crystal here, Tanya Willard's score, and saying, oh yeah, that's not in Western notation, but of course I can interpret and play something, no problem. And so to date, we've had more of that kind of musician involved. But we're really excited in seeing that expand outward as well, and having, you know, other kinds of singers, folk music performers, whatever it might be, you know, interpret these works. And I think as time goes on, that will also shift our relationship to how we work with other musicians, other singers and performers here who don't necessarily have a familiarity with using that kind of score, graphic score, for example, as a prompt for them to create something. But we are already sort of pushing, you know, expanding these different forms of musical and sound response. That's really exciting to see.
Yeah, one of the things that I just kind of realized, Dylan, is that the composers that we worked with and the professional musicians actually tended to play their own music and compose their own music for sounding. So one example is the collaborative video that Raven Chacon, who's a composer, did with Cristobal Martinez, an artist and a scholar. And at the heart of that video is a performance by Nacha Mendez, who's a performer, singer-songwriter here in Santa Fe. And Raven and Nacha composed that song out of dichos, which are kind of sayings, common sayings in Spanish. And it's really an extraordinary piece of music, but the score itself was actually a score that set up the dynamics for the two characters in the film, which are kind of foils for one another in their search for Cibola, or the Seven Cities of Gold, which really perpetuated a lot of Spanish colonialism and settler colonialism here in New Mexico. And then I was also thinking of Heidi Sonungatuk, who's a composer and musician, primarily musician violinist, living in Alaska. And one of the things that she shared with us when we gathered well before the exhibition as part of the working process towards soundings, and she was sharing a series of pieces with us written by another composer for violin. And what she shared with us was her interpretation of them. And she made names for them in her language. And all of the names kind of, in a way, were about the way that she played them. So not only, one of them was, she had the word for itchy or scratchy because it's like a really kind of frenetic piece that you play on the violin. And so she was really interested in that space of translation. So I think that, you know, one of the things, aside from the fact that some of the works get performed over time by different musicians that are invited, others were really about, I think, the space of translation within composition and music, and how the score performs within that.
We have a question here through the Q&A that I'd like to share with you both. There's one of our friends in Vancouver has asked about Dylan's concept of hungry listening. Dylan, would you be able to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I don't want to take up too much space, but to think about it in relationship to the exhibition, I think is interesting. The phrase hungry listening comes from two Halkmelem words. I've been a Halkmelem language learner for a number of years now. And so the word listening, or hualalam, is really deeply embedded within what we do as Stalo people, as Coast Salish people as well, in witnessing the work that goes on in the Longhouse, you know, really important changes in people's lives and the telling of our histories. So listening is really at the heart of that. But the word actually also means witnessing. So it's not just listening as an ear related activity, but it's really a kind of how you are present to the work and to the stories and to the to what is shared within that space, and then you need to bring that forward to your own communities and share that outward. So it's a different kind of sensory presence, this idea of hualalam, or listening, witnessing. And then the word shwalitmesh, or shwalitmesh, or hualitam. Shwalitmesh means hungry, but the word hualitam is the word that we use for settler. And it dates back to the first major arrival or influx of settlers in our territories, who were prospectors, who were there for the gold rush and starving for gold, literally gold fever, and then also literally starving because they are malnourished and making the trip up. And so we showed them where to fish and find food, and but this name stuck, this kind of way of describing these new people that were coming into our territories and just, covering up the river, the sites along the river, prospecting for gold, as a kind of hunger that we perceived. So I use that word to think about what it means, what a concept of settlement, or what our perceptual strategies still might hold. That we need to really actively think about moving forward from in a different way, to find different forms of listening. How can we listen in ways that are not oriented by this settler starvation and hunger, driven towards extracting resources, to extracting knowledge, to extracting the concrete facts about something? How do we really witness differently, right? How do we be present in different ways to the wonder of something that is taking place in front of us, that we don't need to make into a knowable resource? I'm going to speak about this from a academic perspective as well. Universities and scholars, we're so invested in this sort of drive for contribution to knowledge, but it's really a form of resource extraction in a lot of ways that doesn't really attempt to give back or think about the time and terms of what it means to hold knowledge. So this is why I said I'm going to try and speak about it. I can just go on and on and on and on. But really, what I think the exhibition tries to do for me, everything from the curatorial scores down through to the works, down to the ways that we invited artists into workshop processes, is rethink how we give presence to one another and to the work that we're doing through these pieces. So how we listen differently, how these pieces can open us up to a different kind of engagement that is non-extractive.
I don't think any of us could have anticipated just how different the world would be between February and now, and thinking about resources and how we take care of one another. And mounting an exhibition during a time like this has felt on occasion impossible, but also something familiar, like something that we could do, that we knew how to do. And beyond the logistics, the familiar logistics associated with exhibition, we had to prioritize how we care for one another in the process, caring for the artists, caring for staff, caring for our relationships as professionals too. And I think Candice and Dylan, you probably remember conversations that we've had over the last couple months where there was a lot of, well, I don't know, we'll see what happens, but there was so much optimism as well. I think maybe more so on the part of you both that we could do this, that we could figure this out, and knowing that care as an action is so critical to the evolution of so many of the works in the exhibition. I wonder how this period may have shifted the way that you think about the meaning of these works, or how they perform, how they resonate in our space.
That's a good question, because so much of how we built this exhibition was about audiences, how people engage with it. And we had nitty-gritty discussions between yourself, Crystal, and also with Becky at ICI, and also artists about what happens if a sound work, for example, by Sebastian Delaine, what happens if we can't offer headphones to people to experience that? How do we problem solve that? And so we came up with different ways. You came up with different ways to
team
do that.
came up with different ways.
Yeah, and I think that actually what we did collectively was, I think one of the strengths of artists is the ability to improvise. I had to improvise a lot. I know that there were moments when we weren't even sure if the work was going to be able to cross the border, because the prior location was in the United States. So what would that mean? And for me, it's really been a rethink of how we consider audience, how we might listen both, you know, very intimately, because we are able, I think, to have some more intimate gatherings, but how we also listen online, which can be another filter, but also another way of another platform for performance to happen, for example, that we thought very carefully about. So yeah, that's some of the thoughts that I had throughout this whole process.
I'm just looking at the time, and we're about 10 to 8. And if there are any other questions out there in the world, please send them our way. I see there's somebody has raised their hand. I'm still trying to navigate all of this. Hold on a second. I don't know if anyone does have any questions, please send them my way via the Q&A. And I'll boot them over to Candice and Dylan. But before we wrap up, I mean, we have time for, I think, one more question, but before we wrap up, I don't know, Candice or Dylan, if you have any other parting words that you want to offer, any thoughts about the next step for this exhibition too, because it will be going elsewhere in the fall. Anything that you would like to share with us on that front?
Yeah, I mean, there are nuts and bolts things. I mean, one of the things that I've really loved is the ability for the exhibition to move in unexpected directions. You know, So Candice and I have set up this frame that each gallery should commission an artist who is from there, Indigenous artist or artist of color, to engage with the histories perhaps of that place, so that it becomes, you know, in relationship with those histories in that place in a more meaningful way. So we've set up that structure, but there have been really important you know, initiatives to layer in new and different things in each gallery. So I would say I'm really excited to see those offers that galleries make in the future about different directions that things can move in that Candice and I haven't envisioned yet. That's really exciting for me to think about that, having that relationship as part of a touring exhibition, rather than, as you said, Crystal, just sort of putting things in their places and having a more hands-off experience. I mean, it's a much more intensive experience. I think we've all felt, maybe we didn't anticipate quite on the hands-on nature of this, or ICI as well. It's been a very hands-on exhibition for them. It's been great to have their support in their work. But it's also really the privilege of this kind of exhibition to have growth and expansion and different speculative thinking built into its possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think also, you know, thinking about what changes when something travels, and we've thought about this a lot with artists, and in some cases, you know, something is made very site specifically. So how is it possible to recontextualize that? Is it something that, you know, is made only for that place? And so it's been an amazing process to work with artists through some of those questions, which are very much, I think, coming from ideas of land-based protocols, for example, you know, whether something or how something is experienced differently in a different location. So it's really made me think about site-based practices and how we navigate that. Because I think now I realize it's not so simple just to kind of send an artwork somewhere. especially when it's responding to very specific conditions. Sometimes the work needs to change, or sometimes the conditions need to shift as well. So that's something that we've thought about a lot, and definitely is a kind of ongoing question for me.
I have one last question that I'm going to sneak in, and I love this question. So we're asked, or we've been asked, to talk about listening together as co-curators, and I think maybe the listening as co-curators maybe more directly applies to you, Candice and Dylan. But we would like to know what has been listened to together that has helped, informed, or inspired your working together.
One I'll share, I see that question is from Lisa Meyer, who was a participant in a gathering that we had in the context of the exhibition. And one of the things that I would say that wasn't a public aspect that for me was one of the most profound experiences of listening together was a gathering that we had that was a closed gathering, but I feel like we've been having these gatherings over a series of years and kind of expanding our circle to the point where our circle now includes more than 30 people and will include more in the future. And one of the exercises that we did was we all shared a sound. And I remember Lisa's sound, and it was the sound of what are called, they're kind of like little, I think they're little amphibians, or kind of peepers or something like that. And it was a sound that she recorded near where they live. And I just thought that what was kind of extraordinary about all those sound sharings is the fact that a lot of them were of nature. The ones that weren't of nature were in a way initially not necessarily discernible until the stories came. And so for me, this kind of profound relationship between what we were all hearing, which wasn't necessarily all the same, but when those collective of voices came together to describe those sounds, then the sounds kind of, they just grew exponentially. So I really appreciated that exercise of listening together.
Yeah, I think really, I mean, obviously the exhibition itself provides opportunities to listen together, but it's really been threaded through from the very beginning. One of the first things that Candice and I did was create a space in Kingston where we invited the artists to come together. We were listening to work together. We were performing work together, and these are, I don't mean performance in the broadest sense, like doing work together and spending time listening and talking about listening, really has been there, I think, from the very beginning, and shifted a lot since those initial discussions into the exhibition and the listenings event that Candice is talking about that took place at the end of the Agnes Etherington's exhibition, and will happen more in the future. It's great to have these points of stepping in to listen together, just to spend time listening. I think it's really, for me, as someone who has one foot in the sort of academic music history, thing, I don't know what to call it. It's an interesting thing to realize how little time in the classroom or with my music colleagues we spend time listening to something. We often play short excerpts from pieces, or like get to the point, like, the thing you want, the example you want to demonstrate something, but you don't actually listen often to a full 20-minute, hour-long piece, whatever it might be, right? It's sort of that hungry listening extends into this scenario as well too, right? Just get to the important part, right? So this ongoing practice of I was going to say just listening, but spending time together, hearing things, talking about what we're hearing is so incredibly important. Also, I think, to acknowledge the different ways in which we as Indigenous people from all over understand what it means to listen.
Yeah, I was going to take it in a totally different direction, and now I'm not sure whether I should, because one of the things that I pay attention to is, or try to pay attention to, is listening to these early recordings, not just the quality of them, because a lot of them were done on wax cylinder, but the quality of people's voices, and how the quality of their voices would be different if you were singing for an anthropologist as opposed to if you're singing in front of your family or your clan. But one of the things that, and this was embedded in Lisa's question of what we've been listening to, one of the things I've been listening to a lot is noise music. In fact, in part because Raven, my husband, a composer, is part of that music scene. But one of the reasons that I say it is because there's a kind of transformative potential in that space when something becomes not necessarily so loud, but so resonant that it's physical. So I think that that's also one of the potentials of sound, is that you feel it resonating also through your entire body. So it's not just your ears as a resonant space, but your entire body becomes a kind of vessel for that sound.
We have one final question that I think I'd love to hear your answer to, and I don't know if you can see it there, Candice, but
yeah.
Okay. So the question is abstract. It means, how do we tune out colonial subfrequencies, which is a constant hum, and provide the conditions to better attune ourselves to the voices that have been forgotten or overlooked?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew, for that question. Andrew's also a musician. You know, the way that I'll answer it is also to bring, of course, Dylan into this conversation, because that idea of the colonial subfrequencies comes from his writing and the score that he wrote for the Agnes Etherington for the outdoor space. And it really made me think about, or return to, an exercise that we did at one of the first gatherings in Vancouver, where we went to a site where there was a forest removal of a village. I believe it was in 1914, just under the Burrard Bridge. And we were talking a lot at that time of the what's called the Vancouver Soundscape Project, that's hosted by Simon Fraser University, and the kind of active editing that was happening, I think, from what I understand, in those early recordings, where they weren't paying attention to things like the sound of traffic, for example, the kind of urban frequencies, which I understand now as kind of colonial subfrequencies. So I think that what that exercise did, when we sat under that bridge and we thought about not only displacement and the sounds that are lost, the silences of displacement, but also attuning yourself to everything that's around that has been built since. And I think when you become aware of that, then perhaps you're also able to listen beyond them. So I think that was an exercise in listening beyond. And the way that we did that as well was to invite a number of people to speak about that time. So this idea of a kind of sovereignty of narrative, of history. So that would be one answer, but Dylan, you probably have a more expansive answer to that.
No, I think, you know, what you're saying about the sort of, well, I mean, the built environment for me always has a sub-frequency that we're not attuned to, or I'm not attuned to in a conscious way. And so I think those are important things to attune ourselves to. Like, and when I say sub-frequency, I don't necessarily just mean the oral, but like the felt impact, how we listen to that vibration through and within our bodies. And that has always had a major impact on us, continues to have a major impact on us. The time that we spend in buildings generally, not every building is the same, obviously, but I was really thinking, being a newcomer to Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory in Kingston, the impact that colonial buildings were having on me all the time I was spending. You know, Kingston, built to be the first capital of Canada, and for a very small period of time was that. But all of these limestone buildings, you know, that are so highly valued as historical buildings, were really, to me, feeling, there was a real felt impact upon my body, and there still is. But I also wanted to think about those sub-frequencies, not in the sense of loss. And I'll credit, I had a colleague, Margaret Walker, in the Dance School of Music and Drama. She's an ethnomusicologist who was part of a meeting that I had there as we were in the lead up to soundings at the Agnes Etherington, and she said, well, limestone is actually porous. You know, and I thought, I suddenly just shifted my entire sense of like the potential for that subfrequency to be otherwise, right? That these extremely oppressive colonial buildings that are made to have a kind of permanence allow water to pass through, you know, and perhaps other things as well. So it was a call for me to think about the potential not to just merely feel the sort of the impact or feeling of loss in that subfrequency, but the potential for, you know, noting it, maybe holding it there, and then saying, okay, what else? What more?
I think that's a lovely place to end our conversation, at least for this moment. Candice and Dylan, thank you so much for sharing your afternoon, our evening, and all the wonderful context that that led to soundings being what it is. For those of us who, or for those of you who've been listening to the conversation, it was recorded and it should be available online in the days ahead, either through the gallery's Facebook page or through some other means that we have yet to determine. And stay tuned to the gallery's social media channels for more information on other conversations or performances that will be available online for future viewing. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night, afternoon.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thanks, Crystal.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.